Good evening, everybody. I'm so excited to talk about Pass Me By. I've got my copies all laid out behind me, and they are, of course, available at Shelf Life. I don't have the special Rhizo version from there yet, and I heard there's not many left, so that's the one I don't have. But yeah. I have a lot of questions, so I'm gonna jump into them. Okay. So the arts in general, be it comics or anything, they usually bear the weight of needing to balance like a rigorous workload. Anybody working in the arts is working their ass off with the desire to also channel some kind of like undisciplined cultural production, right? This feeling of like, you know, just fresh, confident, like easy in some way while working your ass off at the same time. Do you feel like collaboration is the key to being able to pull off a comic that feels so like so confident? I think it is.
I think it's definitely a big part of it. Yeah, I mean, talking about the amount of work that goes into it, like that's very real.
I mean, especially the feelings right now. We've been feeling the weight of freelance and like trying to make these projects happen. But you know, we see the importance of like getting our stories on the shelves, and collaboration is, you know, we're kind of helping build each other up at the same time, and that's, you know, the most crucial part of creating things, I guess. Like you got to have good supports, and you have to build each other up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think even outside of just like a strict collaborative process, that's so important. But yeah, then it looks easy. That's the trick, right? To like have things flow in a way that's just feels like that's the way it should be.
Yeah. So reading both together, now that we've got 1 and 2 out, it feels like there's reveals that are kind of hinted at in book 1 that you start to see in book 2. As we go forward in the series, is it going to seem more and more like Gone Fishing is full of little secrets and cookies?
I think a big thing that we wanted to do with this series is like benefit the reader if they kind of go back and read the first book after reading the second book. We wanted to make something that kind of spoke to the past, spoke to the future, and the kind of narrative spoke to each other. So in one example, you know, Ed has a keychain in Gone Fishing that's actually the hotel keychain from the first from Electric Vice. So we're kind of trying to connect like certain elements and mementos that Ed would have kept as like parts of the memory. But yeah,
also like similar like experiences and like, you know, like things in relationships that sort of repeat through time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we're definitely trying to make something where there's like a rewarding factor. So like rereading the books and like looking closely at a lot of the details that are laid in.
Yeah,
I try not to make it like overwhelming with stuff like that. I like if that's like an extra layer for like someone who's spending more time with the book, they start to pick those things up. But if you like casually read through it, you might glance over some things.
Yeah, like when we they stand alone really easily, but when you read them together, the thing that you really get in volume 2 is like Ed's granddaughter is waiting through the whole flashback part of it, like waiting, and you know, we don't know how much she knows about Ed's dementia, about his condition, because it seems like the communication is broken down with his daughter Sophie, so we don't know if Lily's kind of picking up more or less, and so Ed's dignity might really be on the line. But as we go forward, do you kind of expect your readers to like get their shit together and be caught up, or do you feel like each one is going to have this standalone quality?
So okay, so the way this is the extremely dumb narrative-wise, or not narrative-wise, just like what I'm talking about. But basically, I accidentally watched the second season of The Marvelous Miss Maisel before I watched the first season of The Marvelous Miss Maisel. So I wanted to do that with the book, where you could jump into the second book before you read the first book. So then you could go back and read the first book and kind of get a better context of what's going on in the second book. but I wanted it to be able that they were like solitary experiences that like benefited each other. Once you read the first book or you read the second book first, you kind of had the ability to enter into it whichever way. That was a non sequitur, but it is relevant.
Yeah, I think that's something that we have that we need to think about with the format going forward, because we made a really deliberate choice to have these sort of two separate narratives that were connected through this character and through time. And so yeah, we're talking now about like whether that's something that we keep going forward with. Each book is kind of its own chapter, almost like a different season of a television show that's like connected to each other.
I think that
we're like starting to work those back together.
Yeah,
and
I think we're kind of going to try to explore also like the more surreal elements of like as dementia progresses, the kind of fading of memories, but also those moments where they progress forward and they become really prominent. So we're kind of trying to explore ways to like allow the narrative to speak for itself instead of having like the reader be kind of carefully led through it.
I think there's a lot of potential there for us because we are interested in like taking the reader along for a ride in these experiences. Like that's where in the first book there's jumps in time that are sort of hidden and imperceptible and you don't quite know what's going on. There's like clues in like clothing and setting.
Yeah.
Because we wanted you to kind of feel that confusion that Ed's feeling. And then in book 2, you get lost in a memory with Ed for an entire day while he's going to pick up his granddaughter. So you're still very much like in that experience, and we wrote that book as a memory, and we kind of allowed ourselves to like dramatize things and like sort of we allowed ourselves with some like play in how the story worked out based on how you might remember things rather than how they might actually happen. Not on it, but
I relate to that so hard. Like my grandpa had dementia, and you know, my mom was the one who like was always responsible for his living circumstances and details about his life. And so with him and we could have this relationship that was about something else, and I really got to kind of mine the details of stories that were, you know, important to me, like things I wanted to know more about. So I'm really excited about Ed talking to his granddaughter. Like I'm hoping maybe there's just like something like that. I mean that's reading my own thing into it. But I'm, you know, my favorite story was always the ones about my grandpa riding trains, like hopping on trains, like just like train hopping, and he would just be headed out of town, like anywhere. And that was one of the details that I got after the 5th time telling the story of like him saying, oh yeah, I wasn't going anywhere in particular. I was just trying to get out of Black Diamond. Like, oh, okay. Like it was anywhere. Like this thing is like, oh, I get it. But I'm excited to find out these things, but I'm wondering what you guys have already decided on. Do you have things all like outlined, thumbnailed, or just kind of a vague like direction?
It's a scattering of things. Like I think we have sort of the like larger structure of what we want to happen. We have a really strong idea of how we want to tie things up towards the end. Then there's bits and pieces that are written throughout that. There's a like huge chunk of what would probably be book 4 that I wrote like 2 years ago in what I now understand as a manic episode, where I just like probably like 60 pages of comic. 60
I got like
maybe. It was a lot.
It was literally at like 4 a.m. I got like a Google Docs notification. Kyle Simmers is added to the document, and it's like 60 pages of like.
And then I went back to a cafe the next day and just wrote all day and like hammered out.
But those are the moments like that's a huge section of what we want to like. That's actually a huge section of Jodie's story too, because we've been talking a lot about where we want to take characters that we're presenting and like what importance they have in terms. But we're also, I think, a big thing that I keep talking about is like we're kind of learning with the characters as we're writing them. So like over time, we're kind of learning what the characters are experiencing and what they're going through as we're kind of going through similar things ourselves, or kind of experiencing the world as it's changing things now. So
we learn about our characters over time, and like that's the most exciting part about the story is like the things that you pick up on that were like seeded before you even knew it, or you know, the characters just kind of take on a life of their own, and so through a process of us talking to each other, we are able to figure out like how this character would respond in a certain situation, and that's where that collaboration comes in, because we both have sometimes different understandings of characters. That's actually really beneficial to like getting a more multifaceted character. Yeah.
Yeah, there's like lots of dark kind of places being hinted at on the fringes of the story. Like, we don't know what's happened to the person we assume is Lily's dad, Colin, if he's sick or injured or leaving them. We don't know why Ed has a family but lives alone. We don't know what happened with his dad when Rory says like, with your dad and all. It's sort of this throwaway thing where you're like, what happened with his dad? And we don't know why Lily's just been sitting around the house and needs this other thing, like what's gone on in her life. And we talked about this a little bit already, where, you know, life is so complicated, but like, especially I think in the modern age, we all relate. So it's like, we don't necessarily need to know what's going on with all those people. And I love how the story is written in a way that you don't necessarily feel like you have to get back to each of these hooks. So do you think chaos is like a common enough state of being for most people that we can just let Ed kind of live in it a little bit? Is that fine?
Yeah, I mean, the injection of like chaos, the piece of like not knowing those elements, I actually think is a way for like people to bring their own experiences into the story and like bring their own understanding of where these relationships may have fallen apart. I think that there are some that we definitely want to like chase down and like explore relationships, but I don't think that we're going to be obsessed with sort of putting a like clean
I think
a lot of them.
like ambiguity is a pretty big part of like everyday experience, and I think also like kind of the gray areas of human interaction is like a pretty big part of like the characters I like to write. And kind of like, you know, humans are really complex creatures, and like there's certain experiences that you hint to, and there's certain traumas that kind of almost exist at the corners of your life but aren't necessarily like definitive characteristics. Like things happen to people, but people aren't exactly made up of all of that. I don't know. I just think there's so much complexity to people, and that's what I really wanted to capture with all the characters in the Past Goodbye series.
Yeah, like we did write that Ed's got a lot going on.
Yeah,
it's like,
but we all got a lot going on.
We didn't really write a simple story, but God, if that doesn't seem like the way that things are, and I don't know, that's life's a lot.
It's very human.
A lot going on. So if we're trying to like capture, you know, this particular moment in that person's life, there's a lot involved in that reaches into other moments and that reaches into other people.
And I think in life, things don't like get tied up in tidy little bows either. I think a lot of times they like end up pretty messy. So chaos is like kind of inevitable. And I think it might be unfriendly to say that that's what we put our characters through, but that's kind of what everyone else goes through too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I love how much we have to assume about Ed's situation, like present and past. We're getting this really distilled sort of picture of what's important to his identity. And I was wondering if you feel like the process of writing is like one big kind of forgetting, like a distillation into the most sort of cherished thing.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
I definitely think of like this like this book becomes like a sort of like memory receptacle in some way. Like there's some, you know, there's like experience and there's time embedded in it in a certain way. And because a lot of that is written from like our lives or like stories that we had passed on to us, and like so there's a reality that's now embedded in that book. I like that becomes this kind of like magic relic that acts as like external memory,
a conduit.
Right.
Yeah, but I always think too, like I use automatic writing a lot in my work, where you just kind of like you let yourself just like explore thoughts and patterns and kind of fall down corridors and things and just see where you end up. And I always joke, like, you know, write in a weekend and then edit for like 2 years. But just jumping into it, I think, is like the best way to discover what you're trying to find, right?
Yeah, there's like a huge theme of mistakes that we choose through the book, which is wonderful. And I was wondering because it seems like there's this connection between like Electric Vice lyrics kind of defining rebellion, and implicitly like the process of coming out, and then these mistakes that Ed makes because of his condition, and it's sort of this human condition, because we're all going to eventually get into this place in our lives where our bodies fail us somehow, like nobody gets out alive. So I was wondering if you always saw that kind of connection between like defying social rules and the human condition, or if it's been creeping up like in the process of writing the book. Like, was it a kernel for inspiration, or is it this thing that's just kind of like wound its way in?
I think a lot of that is me.
I think that was there from the beginning with Ryan, and that grew for me.
Yeah.
Would be I think it was both.
I think I infected you and I ruined you. No, a lot of that was actually really prevalent in my art practice before I it started kind of. I always think, Pass Me By. It's electric. Gone Fishing is a very quiet story. It's a lot of Kyle's like very early experiences with like small town life and kind of early things that we were dealing with, like late college life and all of those like small things. And then Electric Vice is like a lot more of a connection of both of our worlds and like both of our practices, and like a lot of things that like I was bringing up, because like a lot of the songs are like, again, automatic writing is a really prevalent thing in my practice, and I use that a lot to write a lot of my text pieces and things like that. And a lot of those show up in both in the background in Electric Vice and some of the scenes, but also like they're in a lot of the lyrics as well. So I think rebellion is a pretty core. I always wanted to be a punk, but I was never cool enough until now. I think I'm like an adult. Like I always joke that I'm like a punk manager who like works at a Wendy's, but I don't work at I don't have a job. But yeah, like I think that's always been there, and I'm forcing it now.
I think it works very well.
I think it works together.
I think it's been interesting to see how that like incorporates itself into the story, and
it challenges, I think, a lot of the elements that were really prevalent in book one, and especially in like talking about growing up in the prairies. Like I grew up in Langdon and Calgary, but Kyle grew up in Bashaw, so like we have really mixed experiences of what like particularly like Albertan prairie life was, and like what that existence was, and how we could challenge that between the two books is like a really interesting dialogue, I think.
Yeah. One thing that I've seen that keeps coming up is like cars. There's all this stuff with cars, and Ed's car is this sort of happy place for him, and he's got all these blissful memories of driving from place to place in the VW and his past. But then we know there's been dangerous rides, there's like crashes, and we know Ed's driving with a suspended license, which is a bit foreboding. So I was wondering, do you have a complicated relationship with cars? Like, is it a love-hate thing?
Cars are super existential. Like they're such a powerful like metaphor for like how you like propel yourself around in the world and control you have. And like
one time, Derek, Kyle's sibling was here, and Derek was like, why do you use cars so much? Like, what is it? And both me and Kyle were like, it's a metaphor.
Yeah.
And I remember looking back and being like, ugh, God. But it's a lot about like movement, and it's a lot about like the way that time moves with you, and like, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of like, again, kind of like a shifting, ambiguous nature in cars, and like the idea of the space in between moments is really captivating, and also just like slowing down and like really pacing our stories, that like we like really driving is such a long take cinematic sequence, because it's kind of capturing those like, when I think of memory and I think of like what important moments are, I always think of like the long drawn out car sequences of like getting gas at 3 a.m. in like a snowstorm, or like those moments that seem endless, but they're just like tiny snippets of time. And I think that's like really crucial to our book.
Yeah. So this story, I feel like this comic it's one that really establishes its existence as a comic as like the preferred medium. It's the thing in and of itself. It's not just a way to prove concept or establish intellectual property. It's like it is the thing. And for whatever reason, comics, they sit like a little outside of fine art, but then they're creator controlled and they're directed at sort of a general population who can afford them. It's not somebody who can purchase this exclusive product, but there's always this sort of thing that hangs over you where you go, well, in a world driven by the idea that a great idea really should be a movie or should be a show, or you're gonna give up on maybe a lot of money and, like, more importantly, a wider reach. I've got so many questions about seeing Pass Me By adapted, and like, because you're just so partway through, like, what would you insist on if that was going to happen? Do you have to finish it first? If like something came up, would you pursue it?
We could George Martin it and just like peace out before the last is done.
Yeah. It takes a long time to finish a comic series.
It does take a long time. I think we would need to be at least working on book 4.
Yeah.
But I think that's definitely something we like to think about. That's a huge part of how we wrote and illustrated book 1 and book 2 is through researching film and television, and we write in a very cinematic way. So I think like a translation to the screen would work very well.
It's in the same way where it's like, we were kind of speaking with film language when we were approaching comics at first. We again, like taking shots and like really spending time on the moments in between, like the burning of a cigarette, the car shots, the lingering moments. Like that's a really cinematic approach to comics, we feel, and a really fluid nature to also Kyle's illustrations are also like visually. That's something I've always wondered, but if we ever did transfer to like cinema or like film or something like that, like how would we translate Kyle's illustrations and Kyle's artwork, which is so unbelievably crucial to the narrative? Like the colors are so important, and like the way that we're structuring like the fluid nature of the characters, and like I don't know, it's hard because
I think I definitely like that. Like I would always want it to exist as a comic.
Absolutely.
Probably first and like foremost. But I think that an adaptation would, like, I think that there's a lot that a television series could do in terms of like reach and like adaptation to a story like this.
Yeah.
But I think that then like having like the comic that you can go back to and get the real deal, the version of Scott Pilgrim where they go to Honest Ed's and it's wild, it's wild, right? Like the
R.I.P. Honest.
There would always be more to reward the comic reader, but
I mean, it would be cool.
It would be great.
It would be nice.
Yeah.
We don't want Netflix though.
Don't say that. You can't say that.
Fuck it. Just kidding.
So like, I'm always trying to find good theory about comics. There's not much of it. Like Hillary Shute is good. She's got a whole book called Why Comics, and even she seems always to be sort of establishing this like defense of why we want to have a comic, and a lot of the time it's like, because look, they make all this money, and you're like, this is not a real theory. No. And it's kind of like a very North American position. It's very straight in a way, this insistence on a fight for something's right to exist. And I kind of wondered, like, even though Pass Me By doesn't feel very meta, if when you fill a whole page with a statement like, we can make all the mistakes we want, and you start the whole series off with the words fuck it, if that's like kind of a mission statement about comics, like creating comics in general.
I mean, our dedicated ends with to us, to stupid us. And I remember writing that and being like, yeah, that's relevant still. Like that'll be relevant. Because you have to be kind of an idiot to decide to fall into the trap that is creating things, but you can't help it sometimes, right? I forgot the question.
Yeah, fuck it. Is that your mission statement? Fuck
Basically.
It.
I mean, I think fuck it has to be a mission statement in all general statements.
Honestly, though, that's just like kind of like with regards to like making this book, like sometimes the state of the world, you just go fuck it. Like I guess because what else am I?
I was just joking about our last launch and being like, I think we're worse now than we were then, but we were going through technically worse things, but we're just like better at dealing with them now. So it's like, It's like, fuck it is like the only way to get through it. So fuck it.
Yeah.
I think also too, I've been saying this at everything, and I'm going to say it only one more time, and then I'll never say it again because too many podcasts have heard it now. But it's that you have to make friends with failure because it's such an inevitability with creating, and like it's a triumph when like you look back at your first failure and you see what you're making now, because that whole arc and all of that you've been through is so important, and it's such a crucial part of being an artist and being a maker, because like and being a human. I made a million mistakes, and like thank God I've made those, right?
As an artist, you get to see.
So yeah, I can go look back and be like, that was a mistake. That was a mistake. That was a mistake. But you know, those records are also signatures of where we've been. So we can't get rid of all of those. So,
yeah. So there's kind of an irony in the idea of like being taught to rebel, which is sort of like what happens to Ed. And in preparation for the talk, I read Jack Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure, which I loved.
oh, that's cool.
Where you were both familiar with it from school or something, maybe. And like they use Dory from Finding Nemo, talk about her a lot, like her, you know, the way she forgets her past, her family, social norms, like creates this whole new, you know, family that she chooses on her own terms. And it, like I listening to that, I thought about Ed, and you know, he's leaving his life to go join Electric Vice, and then in his like present sort of future life, he's got this really important friendship with Rory. So he does have this, you know, thing where he's chosen his family in some way, or they've chosen each other. And it's kind of very Zen, this idea that like that unknowing doesn't stand in the way of wisdom, right? Like that you become more wise. And I was wondering if you sort of felt that way about the character, if Ed is becoming wiser as he forgets.
It's hard to say. It's like, we talked about it as kind of a reverse coming of age story, in the sense that like a lot of what Ed is going through kind of reverts him back to a lot of childhood ways, and kind of helps him reaccess a lot of his old dealings with like Electric Vice and rebellion and all those things. I don't know. It's a hard question.
It's yeah, because I think we do want to like be really careful with how we treat like the dementia as it progresses in the story. So I'm worried if it turned that into like this like wide stage that it might not be.
And I think what I'm more interested in is like, you know, you were talking a lot earlier about your relationship to your grandfather and like all of those things. It's like that's such a really important dynamic, is like, you know, the way that an elder gets to connect and like share those narratives and those stories, and maybe they're not 100% understood, but the fact that like that opportunity to share them is so much more important to me than like necessarily making and like understand everything more with as dementia goes. I don't know.
It's definitely like there's a presence that I think I would like to incorporate in where like my grandmother's progressed into later stages than when I started writing the book, and has become highly present and like sort of exists in the present, in like a very present moment. So that can mean that if she's staring out a window looking at birds and it's a sunny day, that's all there is, and it's fantastic. But if things are going wrong and she's confused about where she is, then that's all there is too. Like it's this very acute, very close version of life.
I think what we're getting down to is that it's really complex, and we like really want to be careful about how we approach talking about, you know, especially Ed and Lily's relationship, because there is so much complexities in how, you know, you talk to a person who's going through that, in terms of also Lily and like how Lily would go through that. And Lily also too, like if we're not going to talk about what's happened with Colin, but like Lily has trauma of her own, and I think she's bringing a lot of that into that relationship, and she probably doesn't know everything that's happening. So yeah, it's hard to say.
Yeah, we try to be really careful with how we write our characters. So that's always like a
got like
lengthy process.
I got a
was
2-second nosebleed while we were talking about
oh my
that,
goodness,
so.
yeah. But yeah, that's the stuff that like through those conversations, the way that those stories pan out reveal themselves to us. And so yeah, it's an ongoing process that it's exciting to go down.
Yeah. Okay, so one quote I found really interesting from this Queer Art of Failure. Halberstam says, only in the realm of animation can we find an alternative to the strict maintenance of hegemony that we see in the media. And I was wondering if you forgot, like, do you think he's forgetting to include comics in that? Do you think comics are also capable of sustaining a utopia?
I don't know if anything's
Maybe?
utopia, but
Yeah.
what's that potential towards? I think that they have potential for impact. I think they have potential to like affect people and have.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we, like with comics, you have an ability to speak to, I think a big thing is like we're trying to get connections to so many bridges of different people and like build empathy between tons of different people and like maybe connect the story to people who want to connect with a queer story and maybe queer people who want to connect with a story about dementia and like build narratives that speak to tons of different people. And like I think comics have that ability to speak to tons of different people because they're a lot more accessible than a novel, or they're a lot more accessible than a film sometimes. And I hope only that we can build more accessibility and make it more like something that a lot of people can connect to.
I like that our book is like it's a pretty quick read. Like we're not too dialogue heavy. We let a lot of visuals do a lot of the storytelling.
We're not too dialogue heavy.
Sometimes
there's a lot of dialogue.
But I think it flows really well.
It
so,
does. Yeah.
So it's easy for like a person who's even like new to graphic novels to read and dig into, I think. So
yeah, and I think too, with our first book, we're really challenging the reader with the second book, because I think a lot of things that we're bringing up, a lot of themes that we're bringing up are very, very coded. Like there's a lot of coded queer themes in the first book, and there's a lot of, behind the scene things or secrets or suggested things more so. And then with our second book, we kind of just really went balls to the walls immediately. So I think some people might have been surprised by it at first, but I think it's very welcoming and it's very important that people get to enter into that story in ways that are accessible and open to people. So.
Yeah. So when Lou sings "Oh Fantasy Outlaw, Escape with Me" and introduces Ed to the absent audience as the Beast, Lou sets up this fantasy of Ed being kicked out by the whole town, who would like insist that Ed paradoxically then become who he really is. And I was interested in that as a fantasy, and like sort of the idea that that's maybe like a viewpoint we don't see enough of, is that being like a desirable thing, like that maybe maybe having to be yourself with no other option is the better option, and having to hide is actually the worst thing. Do you feel like that's more true, that passing is like a curse?
Yeah, I definitely think that that's something I like for Ed, because that's something that I like for me, and that's been a fun part about writing the stories, like learning more about who I am and how I want to interact with the world.
Yeah.
These characters teach me a lot about myself as much as I'm like, putting myself into this book. I think it's giving a lot back.
And that's only going to keep going forward, like as the characters go and grow and you learn more about all of that. But I think a big thing too is I always, in the second book, there's one line. I think it's literally right when Lou and Ed are about to go off together, where it's like, it's at the end. It's the last part where it's, why would you ever come back from this? And that's the thing, is like with rebellion, and once you kind of explore queer identity and you let yourself free and you let yourself engage in all those things, it is very hard and very traumatic to go back and like change from those positions. So I'm excited to see what more trauma we can put Ed through.
Poor guy.
So like early in the book in volume 2, Ed has a falling out with a bandmate over the idea of authenticity, which like immediately feels like a bigger conversation, not about just playing covers, but it does make me think of like music culture today, which is kind of fascistic. Like we're always seeing these contest shows. There's winners and losers, and people just want to hear a new spin on an old song. And so like this, it was really interesting thinking about the question of authenticity while we're also learning about the history of a band that's like a facsimile of other bands. And I was wondering if that was a hard line to walk, trying to create a band like other bands and then still have authenticity be the subject that you're.
I think that was by like rooting it in history, I guess. Like we were looking a lot at music that was coming out in the early 70s, both in Canada and like US, and like yeah, I'm really into the like research aspect of these things, and so like aesthetically in particular, and like how we were writing some of the lyrics. I'm even using like directly referencing some photography from photographers who were going on tour with bands like that at the time. I really like tapping into that kind of like collective history.
So that one actually is like a bunch of like writing jump off. So it's loosely inspired, like the cover joke is loosely inspired because my parents actually met touring around doing cover songs in bars back so I've always just found it really interesting, that kind of space where you have that drive and you have that want and you're touring shitty bars and you're playing cover songs, and occasionally you throw in a real song, and like eventually you give up and just do the cover songs because that's what everybody wants to hear anyways. And there's just a lot of intrigue in those spaces, and there's a lot that I find really, really curious. But on the other level, I think it's interesting that even when you jump back to the story in 1970s, they're still like looking back and being annoyed at like older songs, or like doing songs from like old dead. And I think it's an interesting idea that we're always in a way kind of looking to the past in order to engage with how we're like moving forward. And I find that very prevalent. So where that all comes from, I guess.
Yeah, it really made me think about when we're reading a story that sort of contextualizes an artist as like not this person, but very like Bowie or Freddie Mercury or Boy George or Prince or an Elton, like one of these. It makes you think of the idea of convergence, because like in evolution, that's where different species all develop wings in response to the world that they live in, because wings are handy. And like in scientific and cultural discovery, that would be when an idea shows up at the right time, but in many different places, in many different people's minds, because it's like the right time for the idea. And it makes me wonder, like, do you think that, because capitalism sort of picks one out and goes like, this is the thing, we're going to protect it, we're going to market it, we're going to like try to not promote other people that threaten this one IP that we've already chosen, and that's sort of what you get of history. Like, do you feel like there was way more bands like this? Do you feel like drag rock was way bigger than we kind of know?
Oh yeah.
Oh, absolutely. There's the thing is like, especially once you start approaching like the AIDS crisis and things like that, there is so much undocumented history, and especially amongst the queer community, particularly the Black trans community, like there's so many undocumented people who have been lost around that time, and there's so much undocumented stories and like wonderful spaces for fantasy and for like the ability to kind of let narratives become. Because I think also like I've been really obsessed with the idea of fantasy as, the way that history is created. I think it's such an inevitability that you have to kind of make up a lot of shit in order to create history and create a narrative. So I think, queer people kind of have the ability now to just basically invent stories, and we can like make narratives and make fantasies to kind of create our own histories and our own futures. I don't know. I think that's just why I like telling stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I had a question that ties into that idea actually a lot. Like I loved Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because I read about the Manson murders when I was way too young. So then watching this movie where they go like, no, this is a fantasy and we're just gonna not go there. We don't have to, the story. We're gonna do a different thing. And I wondered, like, are you tempted to do that and pass me by? Because anytime we go back into like 60s, 70s, the AIDS crisis is hanging over our characters' heads. And so I wondered if you felt a responsibility to go there at some point, or if you kind of feel like, oh, this is your own story, you're gonna go where you want. This is a work of fiction. Like, we already know we've lost our elders in a community, like, to that, and that's part of so many stories. Do we have to tell it again, or do you want to? Are you gonna come to it when you come to it?
I think that's in so much of my own art practice that like I think it's a huge element of particularly queer stories. I think that's a huge element of like dealing with shame and dealing with loss and like the kind of intergenerational history and trauma that's associated with those things, that like it's kind of an inevitability that it's going to influence the characters and it's going to be a big part of it. But I think also timeline wise we're a little bit before, so like it's an inevitability, but we kind of don't want to jump right into it because like even though I'm a queer historian, I still don't feel like I have the ability to speak with like a direct understanding of everything that happened.
And I wouldn't want it to just be like a touch point that like wasn't properly explored, because that was such a devastating period, just to like hint at it or in some way like we've done with other things. I don't think
and I think
fair.
a part of that is like almost part of why Ed didn't continue like exploring queerness in a way. I don't know if that's like really sad.
Yeah.
But I think like, that's probably a big part of why like Ed didn't continue to like exist in those spaces, is like there was mass loss in a way that like was unseen at that time, and especially in those spaces. And I think the thing I always just want to keep hammering in, and like the reason why I was like, you know, we're gonna be like we wanted to do glam rock and we wanted to base it in that time, is I wanted to really hammer home that like queer communities and like LGBT spaces have been here forever, and like those spaces have existed forever, and people have always found a way to congregate and a way to like build community and to support. So making a narrative that like speaks to those spaces and speaks to kind of the improbable, the impossible spaces, I think is like really powerful.
Yeah. Do you feel like you know, the 60s were such a time of transition and uncertainty at the same time, and fueled by new tech, TV and photography and print media, and then there was this proliferation of printed imagery and this feedback loop of mimicry and consumer culture and blowback. Do you feel like the era we're living in now is similar?
Kind of.
I mean, yeah, tech has changed our lives.
Tech has changed our lives, absolutely. I think you know, when we look back at like the 60s and the printing press and things like that, like the ability to photocopy 1 million pages in order to staple and hand them out at street corners made like queer zine culture. And like that's a really interesting thing that I think we're kind of maybe finding new approaches. However, NFTs can suck a dick. Like if you like NFTs, I'm sorry. Like, like I'm over it.
What we need is core powered art.
So I hope
if it sits on a wall and doesn't use core, I don't like it. Anyway.
So yeah, I think maybe we're in the era where like again rebellion is crucial, and again it's not asking like permission to make things, and you just kind of have to like really jump in on it, and like there's no room to wait for someone to tell you that there's space for you anymore. I think you just really have to jump into it, and maybe that's kind of the thing that's coming back. But there's so many options now to jump into things. Like there's so many options to get into making stuff.
That feels like a lead into my curiosity about the word diva that you explore. You got Sam calls Avery out for using the word in the negative and says that's what they say about every woman who knows what she wants and asks for it. And we've got Ed like going on his Pretty Woman-esque shopping moment and then shopping in defiance because that's what he wants, and like and then I even saw a connection just in spilling the sugar, like making a mess, and because that's how you get to express yourselves, like, and you get to see it from that above shot on the table. And I wondered though if you think that the word diva has been reclaimed in modern times, or is it still just mostly used to throw shade? What do you think?
I mean, I think especially in drag, diva is definitely
well, that's a big part of it. Is like a lot of the book was written when like I was getting into the drag scene and you were kind of getting into it as well, and like a lot of like the back room, the green room scene is like a big part of like back room sexual antics, like sexual tension and
Yeah.
things like that. Like I think it's just like it's kind of got that kind of fun energy to it where it's kind of making fun of the language in a way, but also like reinventing it. I don't know.
Maybe. About the back room, I'm obsessed with page 100, the full spread. Yeah, like
yeah,
it was. I mean, but
really
is that Ed smashing the mirror, and it's so poignant and feels like something that probably happens all the time to people for so many different reasons. And I love the idea that you can't be sort of your own ambassador into another kind of self when you still have to stare at yourself. But then it's so sexy the way that Lou crawls on top and does that. And I really wondered, was that something that you saw people do all the time? Is this coming out of interactions?
No, not necessarily that.
Not all the time. I don't.
I think it's kind of a play. Sorry, I keep talking over you. But I think it's also like playing with just the seductive play and nature of queer identity and that kind of nature of exploring and discovering and kind of all of that sensuality that's at play. And I think a big part of talking about, you mentioned also the going to the store and then getting I think this is the wrong section for you. That happens every time I go anywhere. It's kind of just, it's part of those things that are really familiar, but are really different that I think are really important to queer identity. And again, that's part of the seductive nature of it all is Lou is mirroring Ed and Ed's kind of exploration of gender and queerness and all those things, but it's also it's seductive, it's sexual, and it's sensual, and it's two people connecting and making a bridge to discovery. And I think that's why I love that scene so much.
Yeah, that's why there's all the mirrors, is how these two people are seeing themselves reflected in each other and starting to gain this understanding. That's there's less separation, and then that shot where they've got the whole spread, they are right together, right? Mm-hmm. They just feel very together in that moment. And I don't even think that either of those characters totally understand what they're experiencing, but that's love. That's love, and that's
love, baby.
Yeah,
that's what life is.
Well, did you it's impossible not to think of Judith Butler a little bit reading this text too, the idea of performative gender and the world being a stage. And there was a great quote from the book I was reading too, the theory, orthodoxy is a luxury we can't afford. It's crucial to surviving, to break the mold. And so we see Ed's life literally transformed on stage. And I was wondering, were you guys drama geeks? Did you have formative stage experiences when you were young?
You wrote some.
I was really bad. I obviously I don't like performing very much. But I did write a play when I was in high school that was performed.
Yeah, I did
anonymous, please.
I was
it was before I knew what surrealism
musical
was.
theater back in my small town.
Yeah.
We had a little community theater group that was really fantastic.
But that's I think musicals and stage moments and I love music videos and I love music and I love all those things. It's a huge part of both of the reasons why we kind of started.
We definitely we talk about referencing film and videos and stuff, but also part of it are those cheesy music videos with high intensity emotion. Absolutely that.
It's
for
such a
the
big
rooftops. We knew where we were pushing that.
And I think that's kind of we kind of edged the musical elements a little bit. We're not quite a musical yet. But there's a lot of musical elements to it because it informs you a lot of what the characters are feeling and what those emotions.
The text gives you such a feeling of music. There's no goofy notes, but we get pages and pages devoted to lyrics and instruments and these voguing kind of beautiful poses. And they anchor the volume, and they're these expansive moments. They feel longer and bigger, and they're this huge part of Ed's life. And they're the best times too. We've got bars, party houses, and stages. they're these kinds of like surreal spaces, and they're interior and exterior at the same time, and their purpose is like to create moments of transgression, and they're really full of bodies. So going through all these and knowing like what time we're in right now, I really wondered, was it heartbreaking drawing all of this and like planning it out during COVID? Like, just like
it was so funny because book one is such like, you know, it's two guys in a boat, two guys in a diner, alone in a truck. Like it's a very lonely story. Like other people are just in silhouette in the background, like it's very lonesome. And we wanted to bring that life and energy into every scene, which resulted in me drawing so many characters.
Like the party scene.
Yeah, I think I was too busy being upset with myself for making myself draw like 30 plus people in a scene to think about how I was sad to not have that for myself.
But it's crazy that every background character has like complexity with it, like going on. Like your illustrations in this one are like I don't know what the heck. Like it's nuts because it's a lot of the background characters are like, you know, Kyle's super influenced by sorry to speak to you, but Kyle's really influenced by like impressionism and like paintings of that period and things like that. And you know, like Hopper is in the background, like Edward Hopper is in the background, and you know, those kind of elements of like the fluid nature of movement that's captured in paintings that I think is like really prevalent in the illustrations as well. You like feel the characters move within scenes, and those are even more prevalent in the music sequences, which are just blasted full of like unbelievable amounts of characters and detail and elements. And I think that really speaks to like the high paced nature of it all. And like the festival element was a pretty important part of it all.
Yeah, that was fun.
We were sorry, we were just joking about how it's interesting that they're doing these giant jam-packed festivals and they can still like only eat at diners and like stay at like really shitty hotels.
Yeah.
Interesting. Relate.
Yeah. Sorry, brief question about pickup at gymnastics.
This is important.
Kids are not home.
Kids are the future.
Yeah. So before they get home, I thought you made such a great choice in allowing Ed and Lou a first night together that, like, of course, Ed doesn't remember, but then also it's not really like their first sexual moment, like nothing happened. And I love that we can trust Lou and that that Ed gets to be comforted but not lose control or lose the memory of like their first kiss. So, you know, I really saw like how waiting and premeditation and decision and control, like they're all presented as sexier than spontaneous connection or helplessness. And like, we know that these ideas kind of come from like a sex negative culture in the past, and we've got this noir film playing in the background, and there's all of these ideas of like good people lose a fight with themselves and then they get to like come together. And so I love that Lou asks us not to judge, and that I don't have to judge Lou. I'm like, oh, I won't. Like, I trust Lou. And I love that there was still this romance playing in the background. And I wondered if that was a real film. And I wondered if you have as hard a time as I do, like convincing yourself that all the surprise kisses that we've seen in the past aren't actually romantic. Like, I'm still like slapping myself and trying to deprogram,
Yeah.
I'm glad that someone finally asked about that scene.
No one's talked about the whole film.
Yeah, that's we did like a rewrite of To Have and Have Not, starring Lauren Bacall,
and Humphrey Bogart.
Yeah, and we actually had those two as like separate scenes at first, where we had just like the TV playing with this thing, and then like the shower scene where Ed's having a moment separated out. I really like when they like collapsed together and like spoke to what Ed was like thinking about.
That's a huge example of like why collaboration works so well, because like I came with this like really honestly pretty depressing hotel scene when I came with like the first ideas that I had with it, and then we worked together on making it like a really really effective scene. And I actually, that's probably one of my favorite scenes in the book. with the Lauren Bacall stuff, because I love Lauren Bacall. She's one of my favorites, but I really wanted to create like a, I don't know, just like a really familiar sadness, but like complex,
And
romantic.
kind of sexy too. Like there's an edge to it as well.
It's complex. It's again, it's part of those things where it's like it's the going back and forth and kind of the way that the two play against each other and fight against feelings and like love and sexuality and consent and like play and all those things are like very, very important. So
we did want to make sure that Lou asked Ed Ed's face
the green room scene.
Yeah.
Consent. Which is another thing. We had like a 40-minute, not argument, but like long discussion about like pronouns for our characters and like consent and like all these things. And they're not real, but like you really want to make a space that like is careful about those things and like is responsible. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you did. And it's so sexy at the same time. Like, you don't lose anything. It's great.
Mama, baby.
So the idea of nostalgia was really foregrounded in the first book, even without all the flashbacks, which was really masterful. Like it was about that and stayed in the present, And then, we get Ed sort of calling into question the meaning of life, asking what it all means when the good times are gone. And it kind of seems like Pass Me By is this answer to that of like, well, look at this beautiful coffee cup and look at the beauty of the world around Ed. But then now we've gone back into the electric pink, like vibrant life before, and it sort of turns the whole thing on its head. And you kind of think, well, maybe no matter what beauty exists in the present, it does not compare, right, to this other life. So I was wondering what your personal feeling about it is. Do you think that a person can peak too soon in their life? Like, do you feel like that's okay?
Wow.
I mean, it's a viewpoint, right?
Well, no, we were just kind of having the dialogue about this, weren't we?
A little bit.
We were just talking about how like sometimes the little things are what make you like keep living and keep like building momentum and like always saying like, well, it's the next thing, and even if it is a coffee cup in the morning or a song you like on the radio, I think that's like a reason and like a meaning. And I don't think it's not necessarily that you won't experience beauty, because I think we have a lot of beautiful elements in the first book in terms of like, the landscape is a huge big part of that. And I think we talk a lot about like the beauty of a night sky or a prairie evening or something like that, which is a little cliched and a little tired, but it's also like really,
it's also pretty
true,
because like I go through periods where it's really hard to like tap into like joy and and ease and rest.
Even that,
but there's always beauty there for me. Like I can still always see that the world is beautiful, even if it feels horrible.
Yeah, and like with we're working on an anthology thing for the anthology coming out with Renegade soon, and a lot of that is about like finding meaning in a time of nothing, and like finding a reason to like keep finding mornings and finding light. But it's hard. It's complex again. The answer to everything, it's complex.
You don't like easy answers over
no, because there is no easy answer.
I don't think I haven't found one.
What do you want for dinner?
Okay, so something for which there's no easy answer. Ed's community in the present is looking out for him, and it's sweet, but like frustrating, especially with the cop who like lets him off the hook for driving without a license, but then says some homophobic shit, and you think, oh, is he letting him off because Ed is like passing for straight, right? Is that part of this dynamic? And so it made me wonder, like, if the stakes are actually higher for older Ed with his dementia in terms of passing in his community, like, and it made me think about the way that kind of coming out is, this thing we associate with younger people, and we think, okay, like we'll tell them it gets better and we got to get people through this stage, but like, do you feel pressure in Pass Me By to find a message that's as good for other communities, to people, you know, who have less time and who are also more, or also dependent on their families? Like, do you feel like you have to have an answer for that, or what do you think about that situation, right?
Questions here.
Yeah, there's a
I'm
couple.
trying to. Okay, so with the coming out stuff, I feel like in life you don't come out once, you come out like 20 million times, and you're like constantly changing and having to like explore it over and over and over again. So, and I think that's where I come out with that too. And like, we really, so with Lily's going to be a queer character. Like she is a queer character. We've already decided that we're not going to say everything yet, but she is a queer character. And we really want to explore kind of the two ends of like, you know, like a queer elder who's like also closeted and kind of has this history and like this kind of secret narrative and this whole story that's unexplored. And then a young person who's kind of just coming into it and kind of just coming into queerness and like coming into identity and like what that means, and kind of not using, but like having that opportunity to talk with Ed about those things.
That's actually an interesting thing to like comment on, like the change that I've seen in my hometown throughout, where, you know, queer people have existed out in the country for a long time, but people were also very subtle. Lots of times were like subtle. There was like down low communities and like people were out there, but you might have been living a past life. And yeah, growing up, I like had like no queer representation around. But I know now that town has like changed significantly, and particularly in the school, you know, there's a lot of queer youth there, which is great, because I think like everyone would like leave the town and then like go live their life.
That's not fair.
Yeah,
like those queer communities also need a community. There's a really great book by Valerie J. Kirk, I think. It's Queer Prairie Fairies.
Prairie Fairies.
It's available at Shelf Life Books. It's called Prairie Fairies. Ask for it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a really important book in talking about, you know, long-standing queer communities that exist in like the 60s to like now, and like how they, you know, there's always this idea that like you have to move to Toronto or you have to move to Vancouver or like fuck off to America in order to find like a community that speaks to you. But we're also like prairie communities are really important, and communities in like small towns to speak to other queer youth, because like it's an inevitability that queer children are going to exist and trans children are going to exist, and we need to build a better community for like giving them the resources to like understand more about what that experience is. Yeah.
I really noticed like an explosion in the literary world in terms of queer comics, and it gives me a little bit of a pause, because I go like, oh no, is it a trend? And like, are, you know, booksellers and publishers and other market factors, are people seeing this as like some bubble that they're gonna exploit and then like sort of try to just kind of push to the side? Like, do you worry about the next generation in that way? Do you feel like there's like this backlash coming after, and like the idea that communities are being seen maybe as commodities? Does that feel troubling?
Commodification of the community, for sure. Yeah. Rather make the story than not. I think like,
yeah,
you know, it's still important to tell those stories. I think it's just going to be important to keep fighting for them, you know.
Well, yeah, it's true that like and it's amazing that lots of queer books and queer stories are coming out. There's also simultaneously like very negative and very, very bad things that are coming out that are not beneficial. So there is this still like, I feel like people are getting too comfortable. It's like a lot of queer people are getting maybe a little too comfortable, just like with what's happening, but there needs to be more of a response and more like of a drive to tell queer stories, and also tell like non-conventional queer stories. Like I don't need another like white muscled daddy getting a romance story with like a chiseled hairy guy. Like I just don't care anymore. And I think those are such invaluable, like not invaluable, like unimportant stories, and like stories that challenge readers and like bring really complex stories that are like queer stories that bring queer representation and queer identities that are not seen or represented, I want more of a platform for. And I think that's kind of just on its range. And I especially want more trans stories and more trans characters, because I think, and we're trans writers, and I think that's something that like we're only just scratching the surface of right now.
Yeah, I mean, it might seem like there's a lot now, but that's because there was
None. Yeah.
previously, right? So it feels like this wave, but it's been a long time coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't want it to dry up. I'm like, let's keep going. Let's keep this thing going. Yeah. So I was curious about Rory and Ed and how they found each other and found this place of honesty in their friendship. But I also wondered if maybe you're being deliberately vague about it, like, because it's so hard to picture, like, church is going to get in the way, all the other dudes in town are going to get in the way. I was wondering if you're being like deliberately vague so we can just imagine a better world where this friendship is like easier to come by, or I don't know.
That actually is like rooted in some friendships that I have with folks from my hometown. Yeah, I just really like their relationship. I love this like kind of romance that's happening between the two of them, and it's
romance.
It's very romantic. It's like
no more romance.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. He's the voice on his shoulder. It's just like, this is your chance. Like, go for it. Like, and then sad that his friend is leaving, but still like able to eat the pie because there's pie left over, which I relate to so hard because I love pie so much.
Yeah,
that's how Rory feels too, bro.
That is how Rory. Yeah.
I love Rory.
I love Rory. Writing been working a little bit on some stuff for book 3, and I love writing Rory. Like Rory is just like the most like caring person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want Rory to exist in the world, so I'm writing them into mine.
Yeah, it's almost hard. That's one of the places where I'm like, this is utopia. Like,
it's cool too, because like with Rory and like a lot of characters actually, especially in the first book, are based on like people who are in small towns and like people you've encountered and like people I've met too, and like people just kind of know. It's the Canadiana essence of it all, I think. That it's the familiar nature of those characters.
Yeah, and we wanted to show how like you, Ed, just like anyone else, isn't going through this alone and has a supportive community. And even if Ed doesn't have those family members present that you see hanging on the wall, there are people around who are trying to help Ed.
Yeah.
It's even if they're
everyone knows each other.
Yeah.
It kind of lets you feel like free in the story to let Ed have a relationship with himself and explore his identity, because you're not so worried about a safety net. You're like, it's gonna be okay. It's just like the story here is the relationships and the memories, right? So like I was thinking about the idea of hysteria, which they used to say was like to be suffering from remembrance. And of course there was all sorts of real conditions that people had that their doctors were like, this is hysteria again. But that's what they thought was going on a little bit, and wandering uteruses. But so we see this happening to Ed in this way where he doesn't seem to be suffering from his memories yet. Maybe there's some heartbreak coming, and then there's the car radio is this huge part of these things that take him back. And we finally get the lyrics that include the words "pass me by" in this book, which are like, I'm not going to read them all because they're so beautiful. I just want to leave them. And like, it feels like the lyrics and the color choices, this whole filter idea where everything's filtered through, is like, it's coming up for Ed all the time. And he doesn't necessarily have a choice in what he remembers and doesn't, right? Because these things just start to like filter in. And I was wondering if you thought that people generally do get to kind of choose what they remember, or not. Like, do you think it's getting harder these days to choose with the way people sort of curate their social lives and get all these like reminders of people and things and stuff that they're looking at? Do you think it's getting harder and harder to kind of like decide to have something be a part of your memory or part of your life?
I mean, I think that's always been a part of things, but definitely doesn't diminish now. Where yeah, you have like a measure of your will that you're putting into your thoughts and your actions and your life in the world. And then there's a lot of external forces working as well. Like, we're I think I described it once as being like a little like particle on like a wave, crashing across the sea. Like you're moving through these things that are a lot bigger than you, but you do get to play your little role in it.
I had a friend who dated somebody in a band that got really big, just enough that it was on the radio. Like the one song was on the radio in the stores all the time, and I kept hearing it and thinking like, okay, I didn't even meet this guy before this huge breakup. They were maybe going to get engaged, and I couldn't help thinking all the time, like, what is this like for her when I notice it? Like how much more is happening.
I'm constantly disturbed and like overwhelmed with how interconnected the world is, and how like, everyone is kind of always interconnected in some way, and there's some like loose threads that tie us all together that I think is really impressive and really interesting and really scary.
Yeah.
That's kind of all I have in terms of responding. But I don't know, it kind of goes back into the whole like people are complex and relationships are really complex, but songs on the radio.
Yeah, so curious about whether these are songs like by Electric Vice or just songs. It's like, don't tell me, I don't want to know yet. But
like, so our first the Risograph one, can I talk about that?
How it was David Bowie?
Well, it's like, so the Risograph book, we actually used real songs and like we used direct lyrics, and you are not supposed to do that. So we rewrote them for the Renegade edition. So we got to kind of interpret a lot of different musical artists of like the past and also the present. So like on Fishing, we're exploring like, who's some of the artists that we're exploring?
We were like referencing like David Bowie and Scratchly Hip. But the stuff that's like uniquely Electric Vice working into the music on the radio, I think is like a fun play that I would leave there.
Yeah, we're not sure yet. And I think also too, like a lot of more surreal elements where like you're not quite sure if it's like happening in universe or if it's in Ed's mind, or if it's like a memory coming forward. Because I think a big thing that we wanted to do is like a lot of stories about dementia or exploring it from like someone looking in or looking at them, and just seeing that effects, but like using Ed as like a conduit to kind of explore what he would be going through with directly is going to be very good and very different, I hope.
I think it'll be good. Yeah. Okay, so I thought we could open it up to a couple comments or questions from chat from other people watching. But while people sort of send those in, I was wondering if you guys had any book recommendations about other things you're reading, other comics or queer comics or anything else, while we're on the subject of literary genius.
How dare you. Hi, Alexander.
So yeah, what did you guys want to recommend? I told you to prepare for this question.
Oh my gosh,
that was for us.
I brought books. Oh wow, I do have to recommend. Oh wow.
Thank you.
We do.
Well, we always
talk about this
Alice
one.
At Nap Time. Also, ABC Monstrosities, which make you laugh out loud.
I actually gave my copy to my sister, and she loves it, so that's going to a good place. What do we got?
I can get another copy.
Con, Genghis Khan is coming out. When's it coming out? Wait, I don't remember. Very soon. It's very good. I haven't finished it yet, but I just started going through it. The artwork is stunning, and I'm really excited about it. Another Renegade book. Very excited. Also on the same line of this. And then I actually just got this too from Black Panel Press in Toronto. It's Queer in Asia by Seventh. And it's I backed it on Kickstarter, and it's beautiful, and it's stunning work, and like
that looks gorgeous.
Really
absolutely beautiful. And really, again, like nothing that's currently on the market right now. So if you see this book, you should pick it up, because I don't know how well it's doing, and it needs to do better.
Yeah.
Right.
And then another one would be Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me.
I've read that.
Yeah, written by Marika Tamaki, illustrated by Rosemary O'Leary O'Connell. So good. I would looked at that book a ton when I was working on Electric Vice. The way that Rosemary deals with backgrounds and like the way that pink is used as a highlight obviously really worked for me. Really fantastic. Love Marika Tamaki's writing.
I really love this one. Patience and Esser.
Ooh,
It's like, yeah, Edwardian romance between two domestic workers in a house. It's very lovely.
I just got a book. I haven't gotten it yet, but a friend is sending it. It's called Detransition Baby. It's by Tori Peters, and it's also just came out also in October. I think it was earlier than our book, maybe on the 10th.
Okay.
But it's great. It looks like this.
Ooh.
They do have copies at Shelf Life Books. I just had a chance to go in and grab one.
Yeah. I like this one too. Genderqueer.
Yes, we haven't grabbed that one yet, but I was just looking at mine. Is it good?
I blasted through it. Yeah. It was really good. Yeah. Really like, I don't know. It like took the feeling of like my kids like goofy autobio books, like all the kind of Smile and like Raina Telgemeier ones, and just sort of like brought that whole vibe. It's nice. Yeah.
No, I'm really just now starting to. We're hoping to write book 3, and hopefully like after December, we're like really hoping to start writing that. So I'm jumping into my book research, which is where I read like 40 books and then see how other people are approaching conversations around trans identity and queerness and things. So going down that lane. I have other books. Like more books.
I think we're good on books. I need one.
Yeah. Do you need more? I'm good.
Oh, somebody has a question. Daryl said, I'm curious how much Ed attracted to Lou versus how much Ed feels like he wants to be like Lou. There's obvious romantic and sensual tension between the two of them, but when we see Ed trying on more feminine clothes, I'm curious if part of his attraction is because he wants to embody what Lou represents.
That was definitely an element that we like started that conversation with, and like that's sort of the question that we wanted to pose to people through the like early sequences, where it's like Ed sees something in Lou and is working out what that desire is. But that's exactly the way that I framed it when we initially talked about it, was like this desire to like be with or like to be, and
I think
to embody.
Like the way I with being non-binary and like kind of getting to explore gender, I always talk about drag as like almost giving me like an excuse to like give myself the opportunity to like let myself feel those feelings. And maybe not a lot of, but I think parts of like why that initial attraction might have happened was that drive of like, mirroring and self-desire and wanting and things, but so complex.
I mean, I think that's a lot of attraction in any relationship where people see something that they want to be a little bit.
Yeah, and that's what the tension in the page 100, the spread.
Page 100.
Page 100.
Almost like it
landed perfect.
Top 100, yeah.
That's where what's being brought up there as well.
Cool.
Thank you, Steve. I'm curious to hear about your screenplay. It sounds great.
Thank you for the question,
Yes.
Daryl.
Thank you, Daryl.
Daryl, also said they love you and love the book too. So. Cool. Well, I think we've done it. I think we could probably wrap it. Do you have anything else you need to?
Really cool. Yeah. Thank you so much. It was so wonderful to get to talk to you about this, and like you're a wonderful creator in the world, and I love to see what you're doing and talk to you about things. So thank you.
Yeah, it's always great to meet you, Shea. It's always a pleasure when we're able beside each other. So this was a nice.
It's also a really hard conversation, and like you ask the good questions.
Yeah.
So like the ACAD kid in me or the art student in me is like, yes, yes.
Yeah, I could have written just like a 3,000-page essay, and then I was like, no, these have to be questions. It can't just be me talking.
I expect it on my desk on Monday.
I would love to see a book report on our series.
I don't want to see a book report.
Amazing.
were very pretty. Like, okay, yes,
Okay.
they were. I agree. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you, June and Shelf Life as well for hosting. The comments are gonna stay up, and I think people are gonna be able to unmute after we're all done. If anybody would like to have a discussion or stay to talk for a moment, but I think we're gonna